Top concerns of IT executives. The top two are security and privacy. Big concern in Canada is provisioning a SaaS solution hosted in the United States. So everyone in Canada certainly is familiar with PIPEDA, right? Privacy Act. The private information associated with Canadian citizens is profoundly sacred. No one shall touch it without consent and awareness. But in the United States, we've got the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act says, in the name of national security, we can pretty much do whatever we want. Exaggeration, of course, and oversimplification. But clearly those two fly right into the face of each other. So what do we do? So I can see why these two would be key concerns.
I guess from a risk and a compliance and a privacy perspective, any recommendations or guidance, or you've seen any practices out there, how do we help quantify that in these business decisions? How do we measure that risk to start making some of these decisions?
Well, I don't know that people have spent a lot of time thinking about specifically quantifying it, other than the recognition that if you're the company that's collected someone's personal information and find that it's been mandatorily disclosed and outsourced to another jurisdiction, the reputational hit that you face is enormous. The reality is I think many Canadians aren't even aware of where their data goes, although there's increasing concern and questions being asked. I recall, for example, I think it was the CIBC that at one point in time sent out a notification to their customers notifying them that their credit card processing would be outsourced to the United States. And that would be true for all the major card issuers, and had long been the case. But this was the first time that they'd actually taken the proactive step in formally disclosing it. And what they found was a whole bunch of people wanted to change card issuers because for the first time this issue had been brought to their attention. I don't think there's any doubt but that there are real concerns around privacy and the risk associated with that. And so one way is to adopt that mantra that location matters, and you can't quite hermetically seal the information, we know that, but the law already tries to account for that by building in things like the accountability principle. When you collect the information, you're on the hook for it wherever it happens to go. But there are clearly additional risks that arise once it leaves the jurisdiction. And so one way to start thinking about that is obviously trying to keep it here.
Cloud computing, I think Canada is, with the privacy regulations and the contrast between the US and Canada's regulations on privacy, I think we're going to see that the US is going to accelerate a little bit greater, and that Canada is following behind, but of course concerned about the privacy implications of cloud and the cross-border implications of cloud with the US hosting cloud. So I think Canada is ready for cloud, certainly. More specifically, I would suggest it's ready very much so for private cloud right now. Automating your environment, virtualizing your environment, and working your way through to cloud, I think is absolutely, it's something that most businesses anywhere can take advantage of for the agility benefits, some of the cost efficiencies, and all the reasons we talked about in the survey. In the US, for public cloud, that becomes a little bit more of a challenge because of the privacy and regulatory questions. I think there's an awful lot of public cloud use that makes sense, but I think there's a certain amount of hesitancy to use it for many of the same concerns we talked about. And the last piece that's interesting, just as a piece of color, the US is about 30% higher adoption of cloud in general over Canada right now, and I think a lot of that is driven by the privacy regulations.
Are we thinking adequately about how much these new disclosure regulations may harm Canada's competitive advantage? And following on to that, are we not possibly looking at a world where the country with the best regulations may be drawing the business? Is it the Switzerland of IT, where I'm not going to store this data in the U.S. I'm not going to store it, in China. I'm going to store it someplace that really has powerful regulations. And then what good are all the regulations at all if we're living in this global internet world? So I guess there's two parts to that question. Are we doing the right things And which direction are we headed? Are we heading to this kind of Switzerland world, or are we going somewhere else?
With respect to the first question, are we doing the right thing? I've been fairly critical of some of the reforms, and the reference to mandatory disclosure without disclosure, so to speak, so secret disclosure, pops up in a couple of places. One in what's known as lawful access legislation, which has been a recurring piece of legislation that's come up in a number of situations, which I think actually threatens to really reshape what our networks look like in Canada, with mandatory surveillance capabilities by our network providers at a time when we've often been debating some of the concerns associated with deep packet inspection, and effectively requires deep packet inspection capabilities on the part of all network providers so that they can comply with law enforcement demands. I think there's real concerns about establishing that sort of approach. The mandatory disclosure also crops up, or not disclosing disclosure, also crops up in the PIPEDA reforms. And so it builds in the notion that if an organization is required to disclose something to law enforcement, they're prohibited from disclosing that disclosure, and if they still want to do so, they've got to give 30 days warning, and there's the opportunity for law enforcement to contest. And I think it's enormously problematic. I think it runs counter to many of the expectations Canadians would have, and the kind of balance that we've tried to strike within privacy. And that leads, I think, as you did, nicely into this question of, does that threaten what might be seen as a bit of a privacy regulatory advantage? And in some ways, that's not a new issue at all. If you look back to when we established PIPEDA in the first place in the late 90s, much of it came as a direct result of the European Union and its data protection directive, which required that all countries have adequate privacy standards, meet the adequacy standard, in order to be able to shift or transfer personal data from the EU to a third-party country. And Canada received that adequacy standard by virtue of PIPEDA. And at the time, there were many who argued that Canada actually had a competitive advantage as compared to certainly the United States or some other jurisdictions where you'd want to transfer to access, say, the North American market, you'd want to transfer into Canada specifically because we'd had those privacy rules in place. One quick illustration, it's not in a privacy context, but this notion of competing by jurisdiction actually occurred yesterday. With WikiLeaks, which has of course been in the news so much. I mean, WikiLeaks shifted their site to the cloud using Amazon's cloud service, as many people know, and Amazon took that down yesterday under pressure from the US government. And the response from WikiLeaks was, okay, we'll provide our business to a European-based cloud host. And so, I mean, there's an example. It's surprising to think that we'd be your jurisdiction shop on free speech grounds, and the U.S. is not the place where you find yourself hosting your stuff. But that's exactly what happened, and it's exactly on cloud services in that kind of context, where you've got this organization, obviously quite controversial, but this organization taking its content and basically shopping based on the jurisdiction that can provide them with the rules that allow them to continue to exist.
Yeah, I'd like to get back to something Jimmy was talking about the fact that agility should have been at the top of your chart for reasons why cloud is important. There are a lot of ways to define agility. One that I haven't heard touched on is the ability to use the cloud to connect more effectively with suppliers or with customers. And how can this be done in a way that respects the need, the commercial and regulatory requirements for privacy?
We can see it, I think, arising in a couple of different ways. First off, we've seen, particularly at the federal level, the Federal Privacy Commissioner very active in terms of working with other privacy commissioners, other data protection commissioners, on trying to not necessarily create a global privacy framework. I mean, there's a recognition that we're some ways away from that, but adopting by and large global privacy principles with the ability to enforce those principles wherever the data happens to go. While there is a tendency to talk about the Patriot Act and think that we're holier than thou in the sense that we don't have any of those sorts of rules, the reality is that we have a number of rules that are pretty close to what one might find in the United States. And in fact, we've got a number of pieces of legislation currently before the House that envision mandatory disclosure in some instances, and also would prohibit an organization from disclosing the disclosure.
So the agility question, one comment just quickly on comparison. We've seen agility, at least on the US side of the surveys, moving its way up. It used to only be about cost, and we've seen cost moving its way down and agility actually moving up. And part of that is that people feel like they've squeezed everything they can out of that 20%, and they're still left with keep the lights on 80%. So now how can I get at that agility. So we are seeing a little bit of that shift over time, and more so in the US, a little bit ahead, I think, of where we'll be in Canada. But I also want to take the agility question and break it into public versus private cloud. So when you think about public cloud, it's still pretty broad range, but there's a reason I think agility is a challenge in the public cloud. And most of that has to do with things like lock-in. Once you're in a public cloud provider, that's it. But it's also, there's some more fundamental challenges for true agility in the public cloud as well. I think there's a broad adoption needed for an enterprise to be able to sit, a CIO to sit with a service and be able to fairly quickly choose which service to go with, right? And then to switch between those services. There's a certain amount of adoption needed for that kind of agility on the public cloud side. So switch to the private cloud side, I actually think this one, agility is working its way up the list, as I mentioned, in the US specifically. But it's back to phase one, right? Simplicity and standardization.
You have to start with brutal, almost standardization, consolidation, rationalization, simplification, automation. You have to do it internally. You can't go to the cloud because you got a problem. You got to clean up your act in your own organization, and that's going to take you to the cloud.